Understand the Gaza War, Israel-Palestine, in a simple and non-ideological way. Origins of the conflict, the emergence of Israel and the Palestinian cause. The embryo of the conflict dates back to the end of Ottoman rule and the start of the British Mandate in Palestine, 1917 to 1948. The Zionist movement, born in the 19th century, advocated a Jewish national homeland in the region, at the same time that millions of Arab Palestinians had already lived there for generations. After the Second World War and the Holocaust, Jewish immigration increased greatly, raising tensions between communities that disputed land, rights and political futures. In 1947, the UN proposed partitioning Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, a plan accepted by Zionist leaders and rejected by much of the Arab world. With Israel's declaration of independence on 14 May 1948, neighboring countries attacked and triggered the 1948–49 war. Israel emerged victorious and expanded territory beyond that envisaged by the partition. Around 700 to 800,000 Palestinians were displaced or fled, an episode known by Palestinians as the Nakba catastrophe. At the end of the conflict, Israel consolidated a state recognized by many countries. The Palestinians, dispersed and in refugee camps, organized their struggle for self-determination. Wars and escalations of violence in the ensuing decades. There were several wars between Israel and Arab states, 1956, 1967, 1973, among others, and regional episodes of violence. The Six-Day War in 1967 was particularly significant. Israel captured the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai and the Golan Heights, placing millions of Palestinians under Israeli military occupation. Over the years there followed intifadas, popular uprisings, bombings, military operations and cycles of confrontation that alternated peaks of violence with temporary ceasefires. These dynamics prevented the consolidation of a lasting political solution and deepened mutual distrust and trauma. Emergence and rise of Hamas, why it is considered terrorist. Hamas emerged in the context of the First Intifada, late 1980s, as an Islamic movement with roots in Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, as well as a political and social organization, providing community services and religious infrastructure. Hamas developed a military wing, known as the Al-Qassam Brigades, that adopted armed tactics against Israel. There are three central elements that explain why many countries and institutions classify it as a terrorist organization. 1. Deliberate attacks against civilians. Hamas has claimed responsibility for or carried out suicide bombings and attacks targeting civilian populations, not only military targets, causing deaths and injuries among Israeli civilians. Attacking civilians with the aim of spreading terror is a defining characteristic of terrorism. 2. Indiscriminate use of rockets and firearms. The launching of short-range rockets from densely populated areas, without precision and without distinguishing between civilian and military targets, endangers civilian lives and constitutes indiscriminate action. 3. Kidnappings, use of human shields and refusal to recognize Israel. Hamas has conducted kidnappings of civilians and combatants, and there are reports of military assets being placed in civilian locations, schools, hospitals, homes, exposing the population to reprisals. Politically, Hamas has maintained positions of non-recognition of the State of Israel, which has hindered negotiated agreements. These aspects, combined with cross-border attacks, clandestine armament networks and persistent violent activity, have led many states and organizations to label Hamas as a terrorist group. This classification is central to understanding both Israel's security response and the political and economic isolation that fell upon Gaza after Hamas took control of the territory. Palestinian Authority and attempts at dialogue. In the 1990s, there were formal steps towards agreement. The Oslo Accords established mutual recognition between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and created the Palestinian Authority, PA, as a temporary administrative body for Palestinian areas. The PLO authority came to be recognized internationally as the legitimate representative of many Palestinians. The PA, dominated by Fatah and led by Mahmoud Abbas, gained limited authority, civil administration in some urban areas, areas A and B, of the West Bank, while Israel retained military control over much of the territory, Area C. In 2005, Israel withdrew military structures and settlers from Gaza, but in 2007 Hamas seized de facto control of the territory, creating a political division between Gaza, Hamas, and the West Bank, PA, Fatah. This division weakened the Palestinian negotiating position and complicated peace processes. The occupation of the West Bank and its implications. The West Bank remains under Israeli military and civil control since 1967. Since then, Israeli civilian settlements have been built in the West Bank, where Jewish settlers live. The majority of the international community regards these settlements as illegal and an obstacle to a two-state solution. Occupation produces concrete impacts on Palestinian life, checkpoints that restrict movement, limitations on economic activity, land expropriations and disputes over water resources. These facts fuel resentment and make the viability of a contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state more difficult. The blockade of Gaza. Reasons and consequences. After Hamas took Gaza in 2007, Israel, and to a lesser extent Egypt, imposed a land, sea and air blockade on the territory. It is important to explain why this blockade was implemented and also to point out its effects. Declared reasons for the blockade. The Israeli and Egyptian governments justified the blockade as a security measure to prevent the flow of weapons, munitions and dual-use materials, civilian and military, to Hamas, and to reduce the group's capacity to construct infiltration tunnels and launch attacks into Israeli territory. Border control and inspection of goods were presented as ways to protect the Israeli population and to contain an organization that carries out indiscriminate attacks. Humanitarian consequences and criticism. In practice, the blockade has severely reduced the entry of goods, raw materials and fuel, affecting hospitals, water networks, electricity, agriculture and industry. Gaza's economy has repeatedly contracted, increasing unemployment and poverty, and limiting post-conflict recovery. Humanitarian organizations stress that, regardless of security intentions, the blockade has severe effects on innocent civilians and violates basic rights, requiring adequate humanitarian measures and guarantees for the population's welfare. Tension between security and human rights. The correct narrative is twofold. The blockade exists for security reasons, linked to Hamas's actions, but it also produces humanitarian harm that demands international attention. Any serious analysis must acknowledge both sides. Israel's legitimate security concerns and the need to protect Gazan civilians from collapse. The Gaza Strip today in cycles of violence. Gaza is a densely populated territory, with around 2 million inhabitants in a very small area. The cycles of violence between Israel and Hamas typically follow a pattern: incidents or attacks by Hamas, rockets, incursions, bombings, provoke large-scale Israeli military responses. These offensives strike both military targets and civilian infrastructure, causing high casualty numbers and destruction, and triggering further hostilities. Between escalations, temporary ceasefires and intermittent negotiations attempt to restore fragile calm, but the underlying causes, occupation, Palestinian political division and insecurity, persist. Impact on civilians, Israelis and Palestinians. The most tragic aspect of this conflict is the suffering of civilians. In Israel, terrorist attacks and rockets have caused deaths, injuries and a constant climate of insecurity and trauma, especially in border regions. In Gaza, military operations, blockades and the collapse of public services have increased mortality, internal displacement and extreme hardship. Hospitals, schools and essential infrastructure are often damaged, leaving entire populations vulnerable. The loss of life, the destruction of homes and the interruption of education and healthcare produce effects that span generations. Any serious defense of peace requires some clear premises: to recognize Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state, to recognize the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority as the representative interlocutor of many Palestinians, to condemn Hamas when it commits terrorism, and, simultaneously, to condemn violations of human rights and abuses that harm Palestinian civilians. Furthermore, it is essential to reject any form of hatred. Criticism of Israel's policies does not justify anti-Semitism. Support for Palestinian rights cannot serve as a disguise for racist or totalitarian ideologies. Building a sustainable solution will depend on political dialogue, the protection of civilians, security guarantees, and measures that allow both peoples to exist with rights and safety, without hatred or violence.